Thank you. Would like to welcome LO to open their case. Here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep.
Preferred gender pronouns is he, him. Preferred POI method is through the chat. All right. In 3, 2, 1. Environmentalists are sick of being put on the side and constantly alienated from the political discussion that happens in terms of policy making, right? That's why, as environmentalists, we need to support parties that are, one, more likely to win to actually create the policies that we want to benefit the environment, right? Government cannot argue about protecting vulnerable actors without saying how they're going to protect it, especially when they never argue to you how these policies are going to manifest in a political climate that is inherently, that is always, like doesn't necessarily care for them, especially with their socialist, very left ideas of, environment that they talk about, right? So government's benefit only manifest if they prove to you why policies would actually manifest at the end of the day. But two, notice they characterize center-left Green Party as a very capitalistic party, as if we're Republicans, right? No, the prerequisite for this debate to run is that center-left Green parties are also inherently environmentalist, but in different methods. That is to say, we are also going to actually, cater to environmentalist idea, but we're going to marry it with capitalistic ideals, right? So this debate then needs to talk about which party that we are able to support that is able to actually create the protection to my environment that we want to support, right? So that is how OO is going to enter this debate, right? We're going to talk to you about how exactly when you support center-left Green parties, these policies will manifest, and only then we have a table of discussion in the political climate. But two, why even if we do not win, why in the worst case scenario, it's more likely for us to actually, it's better for us as the environmentalists if we support this party rather than Green Party, right? First things first, no thank you. Why it's better, why it's more likely for the likelihood is higher on our side. So essentially, the function of political parties is to voice out constituents' needs in the form of policies that are effective, right? Because your constituents are having problems, and therefore you as a politician needs to voice it out, for example, and that kind of voice needs to actually translate into creating policies, right? That's why some KPIs of politicians is to the number of policies, for example, whether their constituents feel like they are catered in terms of government, and so on and so forth, right? This is especially true for environmentalists who feels there's an need of an urgent and quick change to ensure that the earth doesn't pass the irreversible point, for example, that actions need to be taken to ensure that the most vulnerable environment are actually protected, right? Exactly what government wants. But the problem is that currently the political situation doesn't necessarily cater to that yet, right? We see cases of Green parties failing, for example, in terms of government only in America, only catering to 3%, for example, of the whole freaking political discourse, right? Because they're inherently unpopular. That's why supporting center-left is better, because it's more feasible, right? Two reasons. One, within the center-left Green parties are seen as more realistic because they are able to marry environmental concerns with current system of capitalistic that is already inherent, ingrained, and normalized by the people, right? The policy that manifest looks like the creation of CCC, for example, Civilian Climate Corps, that marries the idea of job creation with environmental protection by ensuring that civilians are enlisted, for example, and like given jobs and wages to ensure that the environment is protected through, for example, like cleanup procedures, or through like ensuring there's green tax to whatever, right? It's more realistic because people feel like the policies actually caters to their most urgent need on the ground, like job creations, wages that people on the ground relate to and support. The first conclusion of this point is that this idea is supported by 65% of people on the ground, right? People are more likely to relate to a certain policy when their most urgent needs are protected, right? Which makes it more likely for our policies to pass in the government, for our campaign to actually be supported by people who are not just environmentalists, because people also feel like, oh, okay, it turns out I can also support environment and also, for example, have my most urgent basic needs fulfilled. So that is the first conclusion, right? That people are more included because people feel like they can care for environment and also care for their well-being. But two, on our side, we think that political situation is not just about like voicing out. It's also about like the idea of money, right? Having the power to actually, like have campaigns or so on and so forth, right? That's why we need to ensure that we also have lots of funding, right? That's why on our side it's better because corporate backing is more feasible, right? We can co-opt them into part of the movement. Talking about how environmental ideas are already sometimes gaining traction on the ground, right? We need to capitalize on that particular trend, but ensuring that the corporates are also co-opted on our side, right? Talking about how, okay, we're going to ensure that on your side, you are making, wrappers that are inherently more biodegradable, for example. You're ensuring that the waste that you're baking is actually manageable, or like green management of waste, for example. Ensuring that on our side, it's more likely for these corporates to actually join in because it's a more popular movement and a more feasible movement. We are allowed to get money, for example, to boost the campaign, to ensure that our campaign also reaches more people, right? Thus creating the environment ideas to be a much more huger talking point, for example, in the political discourse, talking about how now other parties are also put into test about their environmental ideas that is, compared to us as a campaign, right? Putting our campaign to a much more relevant talking point in political discourse, right? What happens on government? On government, it's hard for all of these benefits to manifest exactly because Green Party stands in opposition with the existing capitalistic system that is super entrenched with the society, right? It looks like even the idea of socialism, a party that promotes socialism, is already super unpopular to the people on the ground, right? Because there's huge, mischaracterization campaign that happens that makes it harder for you to fight on the environmental front, but also fight on the socialism front as well. The conclusion is that people on the ground are already turned off by the idea of environments that has to be prioritized in response to them caring for their kids, for example, them caring for their kids' education or for their living wages, so on and so forth, right? Because they feel like they have to give that up, for example, for socialist ideas that doesn't necessarily, cater to the most basic needs. Therefore, they don't want to opt into, right? So it's better on our side because it's not a trade-off, right? People will more likely to join because the enemy that we're talking about is huge energy lobbyists, for example. They're already fighting on the idea that environment is expensive. Caring for environment means you have to lose your job, for example. In OO, we don't do that. We fight the big enemy of lobbyists because our ideas marries capitalism with, for example, environment protection, thus making it more accessible for everyone. But on the worst case scenario, if you don't succeed, why it's better on our side, right? Exactly because the worst case is we only get 4 or 5%, like what's happening in OG. At least on our side, it's better because we are more likely to be approached by big parties, right? Talking about how our framework is more agreeable to them, right? They're more likely to actually marry the policy that we have, like for example, CCC, ingrained into the democratic ideals, for example, of giving, caring for the minorities and the poor, for example. It's more likely for us to join together in coalition exactly because they feel like, oh, we can tap into the 4 or 5% that they have because we can just co-opt some of the policies that they have and modify it to join us, thus making sure that we have a big seat at the table, even if we lose on our side. Very proud to oppose.
Test. Am I audible? Oke, cool. Bentar ya. Boleh. Ya udah kalau gitu dari lo aja.
Mau pakai headset gak? Ya, udah.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. So basically what Kak Randy did in his speech was elaborate on how these policies are going to be so radical and so protective towards indigenous people and so on and so forth. But notice about how their burden before claiming all of these benefits is explaining the feasibility of these green left parties getting into parliament in the very first place, right? The feasibility of them being voted in, because these are really massive policies. These are massive burdens for them to explain how they can change the status quo that much to the point where they're going to be able to save all these disenfranchised communities that is structurally like burdened not only by companies that environmentally destruct all these people, but also other companies that are like basically just discriminatory towards this, right? We think that O is going to win under the pace that our case is much more grounded and much more realistic. I just don't see why their point can stand, right? But before I go into my extension, several responses to their side house. So basically what they try to, the strategy that they take in this debate is trying to fight for the disenfranchised members of the community, right? Talking about Pacific Islanders, talking about other indigenous people and how they deserve to be protected because they're the guardians of the environment, and about how at the very least they're going to be able to raise discussions about the community and so on and so forth. Here's the thing though, this is very ideal, utopic and outdated view of the world, right? Because even in the current status quo, if you do compare them, we think that what happens in the current status quo is that the world and its climates, it has already changed so much to the point where it is ununderstandable simply by like more mythical or more like ethnical means of understanding the environment, right? We think that what happens in the current status quo is that even indigenous people have a hard time keeping up. That means that it's not a sustainable way for you to maintain the environment, right? What you need right now is like science, what you need right now is research and so on and so forth, right? That is to say that even then, their justification of protecting indigenous people is not as much, right? But let's take it at their best, right? That means that what my question would be is that how does policies of green left parties look like on their side of the house, and how is it going to be distinctly different, right? Because my question is that what kind of policies is going to be able to protect indigenous people, but at the same time still able to achieve all these green things, right? We think that what they're going to sacrifice is just the common citizen that happens on Earth. But you compare it like this: when people have the option to live modern but still choose to live in indigenous societies, they do it by choice, they do it by consent, right? For them to execute all these policies, they're taking away the agency and the consent of poor people who do not consent to living in poor conditions but are already dependent on oil, right? You force them to go through so many structural changes knowing fully well that they have no way to defend themselves, right? Here's the thing though, if they are not able to like characterize what kind of policies is going to be able to solve both of these problems, then their benefits cannot fly and must not be taken for granted, right? Compare this to the CCC and the job creation extension that we bought and thought on corporate backing. We think that it's just a much more believable because we're able to characterize and the process how it happens, right? But second response to their case, right? They try to tell you about how center-left base is bad because it's based on consumer analysis, environmental is not that profitable, right? We think that this is just exaggerated and just taking what happens in the current status quo. Because what happens in the current status quo is that companies as big as Tesla and so on and so forth are competing in terms of developing green energy, right? This is something that's going to take over the world soon. That's why as much companies are possible are like doing research in it, right? But second of all, people care, but they want diverse options, right? I think people in general already know that global warming exists, people in general, but the thing is they just don't have like any options to directly help. For example, they try to like use the degradable plastic from Indomaret, but they don't know what to do beyond it, right? This is where the center left green parties come in, right? Because we're the one that able to mechanize to them how in very simple ways without like people necessarily having to do the extra length, they're still able to save the environment and work within the framework that they have been dependent on for so many years, right? So I don't think this is important at all. But lastly, right, they also try to argue on how people on the ground know that environmentalists are against companies. Therefore, marriage between like environmentalism and capitalism is going to be something that's difficult to do, right? So my question then becomes, if the problem is about how environmentalists are being seen as super radical people that you cannot associate with, then exactly how you solve the problem is to make them look more grounded, is to prove that we are not some random SJW kids who do not know the reality of the world and how it operates, by showing that we're able to work even with corporate and we're also able to work with political parties, right? We need to make sure that people understand that environmental betterment is not something that's super utopic, it's something that's available, right? But also understand that there is a spectrum of companies available. Obviously, we're not going to try to go for people like H&M and Uniqlo that are already like known for being environmentally like destructive, right? What we're going for and like center-left green parties is in companies that are already in the first place aiming for the betterment of the environment, right? So we think like these are the companies that we're going to that's going to be able to do later, but other responses will be integrated right? So what I'm going to extend is beyond what happens already when we get into parliament, which is like the more important part of this debate, is talking about how the role of environmentalists and this house is the most important part of this debate, right? Because here's the thing, in this debate, one of the BOP is discussing the interest of the environmentalists and how we're going to best achieve it, right? Here's the thing though, our interest is making sure that we have more allies, right? Why are we able to get a seat in the discussion as pushed by them? We think that exactly because environmentalists exclusively have three things to offer. First of all, we're the ones that are dominating online spaces that are able to like campaign for these center left green parties. Therefore, like the success of their campaign and like the exposure to this party depends on us. Second of all, we have a better analysis of the political landscape that happens on the ground right now. For example, because like center left green parties will probably have much more research on their policies and so on and so forth rather than political landscape, right? We're the ones that able to notice what people on the ground like, what kind of campaigns they like, and so on and so forth. But third of all, we're the ones that able to criticize and to make sure that we have input towards the policies and the campaigns that is put out by center left green parties, right? Here's the thing though, that means that the discussion between environmentalists, companies, and these people are going to be entirely different, but it's all equally the same because this is discussion with the donors of this political party. Here's the thing, we need to make sure that we have like this, if the center left green parties win, we need to be attributed to their win, right? Because otherwise, that means that surveillance and control is not available, right? That means that if center left green parties win under corporate backing, then all these harmful things that they talk to you about will only happen, right? We need to make sure that we are the ones also, like they are pretty much dependent on us, that we have a say in their win to make sure that we can at least mitigate the harms and the negativities that will happen, right? But also, why is this important, right? What can we receive as environmentalists if we go with center-left parties? First of all, we're going to get corporate funding. Essentially, all movements will need funding, right? We can't just operate on the basis of like good faith, or for example, people becoming suddenly dreamily accepting of all these better principles and so on and so forth. We and think that the best way for do this also like have a level of accountability to people and society, right? Second of all, we need parliament, right? They talk to you about discussion on the ground and how they're going to raise awareness about indigenous people. But notice about how this is meaningless if you do not have people who are certain to have support in parliament, right? This is only achievable through ourselves because we're the one that tells you how it's feasible and how we can get people in parliament and how we can make those people, those allies, right? But third of all, grounded policies, right? We need to make sure that these policies are first of all for the green people, second of all, not dominated only by these companies, but third of all, also dependent on us, which are also really dominating the discussion, right? And for all these reasons, we're proud to oppose.
For a note. Okay. Not being narcissistic, just saying. Anyway, sorry if there are that sound. I'm gonna do the speech in 3. Oh wait, I'm audible, right? Oh yeah, a couple of things. I haven't debated for a while, so 1, POI through mic. Second, yeah, POI through mic. Yeah, so gonna start in 3, 2, 1. I'm gonna quote Darion Hotan in here and say that part of the reason why I quit debating for like 7 months is partially because of boredom and like you know, just not fun anymore. But I must say this is quite fun. For clarification, firstly, this debate is about allocation of support. What does this mean? This means that there are a limited amount of resources of support that we can provide to individuals, and hence this debate is about allocating that particular support to specific types of groups. Secondly, the differentiation of opposition and government is that opposition focuses on environment entrenchment and also economical entrenchment only. Gov tries to get a little bit of all of that, right? Gov tries to focus on social betterment, social justice empowerment, and also economical empowerment, while also trying to achieve, you know, green tech. Green environmentalist policy and etc. Right? The problem with OG is that firstly, they focuses on shallow understanding and focuses on execution of those party, not on those party principle. Moreover, they don't focus on explaining why the policy would be different. They specifically only explain why the policy discussion would be different, saying that there are different individuals that are going to enter into it to begin with. Right? Notice that these two things are extremely different, ladies and gentlemen, because the amount of policy that will be created under side government and under side opposition extremely different, never been clarified by underside opening government, right? On worst case and such. They focus us on worst case only, ladies and gentlemen. They focus us on lobbying and discussion being dominated by them. We're going to take up the more moderate case and focus on the best case of the opposition. Even if the environmental policy changes happens, why is it that opening opposition still will not happen? There are three main differentiation coming from side opening government and side opposition, right? Firstly, on side government, we focus on complete change, complete change of the structural system, for example. Meanwhile, opposition just tries to cater the existing, behavior of company. This looks like impulsive. I'm going to give you example there because opening doesn't talk about that. In opposition, they focus on taxation of emission, like Paris Climate Accord Agreement. Meanwhile, in government, we focus on abolishing in general the destruction of company and the oil industry and etc. Right. Secondly, op focuses on economic sector. Gov focuses on exerting like social movement and etc. The third differentiation is that op tipping point focuses on company compliances, like what opening government said, but they don't tell you what government support, right? What opening government should support and closing government should support is that they focus on social destruction, as socialist destruction of individualist needs, seeing community in a more communal sense as opposed to seeing it as a private property and such, right? Two things. Firstly, engagement to opposition. Secondly, to my whole materials about opposition best case and also talking about, the difference in principle. Firstly, opposition mainly talks about likeliness and policy manifestation in terms of job, wages, and etc. 6 rebuttal. Firstly, principally this is bad because then we will not have support for LGBTQ because it's unlikely to do this in Indonesia, right? Notice that the debate about prioritization of support doesn't principally talk about the amount of likeliness, but focuses on the urgency that will provide to this individual. Underside opening opposition, every single part of effort that is hard in the side of society, like fighting for LGBTQ community rights, like fighting for women's rights in Indonesia, will not be done and will not be supported because, well, it's hard and it's unlikely to do that, right? But it focuses on urgency. So principally, even under opposition best case, it is already wrong. Secondly, if societal acceptance is already high, why the heck do we need more support? Notice that a lot of government talks about why is it that societal acceptance is already high? Because this debate talks about prioritization of support and resources. If support from the society is already high, why the heck do we need to, give more prioritization towards opposition, towards opposition effort and etc. Right? So we focus on things that society does not necessarily accept and campaigns on it and try to promote it to society to begin with. Because again, like they say, acceptance in society is still low. The third rebuttal, I think jobs and wages would still exist under our side law. Like just because green left exists doesn't mean that every single individual would be given will be left on the street and will not be left with job. Obviously, there will be some sense of jobs, but it focuses not on company owning them, but perhaps government owning them. Fourth rebuttal, opposition says they will cater to different type of company. Notice that this debate isn't about supporting a different type of company, but focuses on allowing those companies to exist or not to begin with. So when they say that, we're not going to cater to H&M, yeah, you won't, but H&M will still exist and destroy the environment to begin with. Fifth rebuttal, green left are likely, ladies and gentlemen. There are interests and big power like China and Saudi Arabia who exports oil, by the way, that also wants to focus on not selling oil anymore by creating a city, for example, that focuses on technological marvel and green technology because they understand that societal structure like oil and etc. does not stand in the current status quo. There are interests from the government to break down these needs and the structure that is in the status quo, and the situation is not necessarily that dire. Engaging with opposition side being edgy, and not supported by the society, I think it's the opposite because on side government, when we support things like feminist, social structure and social focuses issues and etc., there are more hands on the ground, right? People from different types of background and community who might not care about environmentalist policy would support us because we also support feminist, indigenous community and etc., right? Meaning that we will have more societal support to begin with, and also it is increasing likeliness. Three things. Firstly, underside opposition best case, they will do greenwashing, right? What does this mean? This means that company often make eco-friendly product that doesn't necessarily help the environment to begin with, like Starbucks with their plastic straw. Well, plastic straw are great, but notice that the amount of policy and the amount of destruction to the environment does not come from the plastic straw, but come from the carbon footprint and emission of companies and factories and etc. This is bad because if it doesn't have huge impact, but then it provides the illusion of society. It gives the sense of completion, and society feels like they're doing enough by just buying straw and not destroying the whole structure. Secondly, capitalism will never align because a sense of ownership is good, of good is bad because owning things like private property brought more destruction, increasing production to demand. Individual carbon footprint like the food you bought, cars you have, and etc. Meaning that if you have this thing, you will not opt into reducing oil because you have cars and etc. Secondly, asset ownership. If company owns everything, then obviously we cannot cannot control them. Different with side government, where we control this asset that we have, and it focuses on reducing the land destruction and also the destruction of the environment. Thirdly, the situation is rather dire. Society are compliant and do celebratory stuff. The whole society are entrenched in the capitalist society, and hence that's why we need support and campaign to these causes that are different and new to them to begin with. This is talking about prioritization to begin with. Under opposition best case, let's assume they're best case, right? And saying that all of the benefit of environment is achieved under their side. We say there are additional costs that they're going to have, like women and indigenous people and etc. Right? So on side of government never mechanizes this, by the way. If they achieve their best case, most likely company would cut down on their costs, right? Because they focus on tax cut and etc. The problem with this is that if company focuses on cutting efficiency and bringing tax and etc., they focus on more efficient labor, and labor law would be worse. Women hiring environment will be worse, because then they would focus on more efficiency, because opposition increases the cost of the company to begin with, and etc. Right? So there are additional costs like women movement and etc. that will be harmed under their side, even under their best case scenario, because it still focuses on company being efficient and gaining profit. Right? This is important because there are multiple issues that are often trade off in the society. We do not want to trade off, and in the long term, yes, it is long term, but we feel like this is beneficial and important. Very proud to propose.
Thank you, Member of Go, for that speech. I would like to welcome Member of Op to open the case of CO. Here.
Okay, hello, am I audible?
Yeah, you are.
Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. A few things before going into my arguments, which is first, something's missing in opening, which is first, the role of companies in environment. What is the role of companies actually like in environment when controlled by a government? And second, about how there is no discussion at all about the actual majority of the vulnerable actors, right? Which is the ones actually truly affected by the environmental policies. It's ironic that CG talks how labor laws will be disadvantaged when it isn't spoken about, and how the majority of whom are going to be affected are actually going to be the small businesses that make up the majority, and the working class who work for these big companies depending on this very policies, like, right? Like, for example, people in the working class who work for factories, or people who are fishermen, for example, who depend on capitalism to make their ends meet, right? And we I think, and going into that more into my arguments later. Response before I go into my arguments, which is first about the native minorities, right? I think because we recognize that natives have been developing a culture of working together with nature. Once we input the penalization of environmental damage into like taxes or like penalization into companies, I think the research and development of companies will have more motivation to learn ways of conserving nature from these indigenous people, right? Because they want to cut costs from being penalized for environmental damage, for example. They will want to include indigenous people in the workplace. Furthermore, we think this is good, especially for these minorities struggling to make ends meet in the first place, and especially good because the way they do things will be included into the general public, right? I think this is most likely to happen because they have the traditional and cultural way of actually conserving nature into the way they do things in everyday life, right? So I think they can be included more more by the companies, and especially good for these minorities struggling to make ends meet in the first place, and especially good because the way they do things will be included into the general public, which because the companies implement these ways that Aboriginals do, then the majority will start to do it as well, right? Okay, going into my arguments, which is first about what actually happening in the status quo, second about what center-left parties will actually do with these companies, and yeah, that is the main two arguments. So first of all, about the status quo, right? I think center-left is more realistic with the current system, right? Like how Owo said is actually, because people are used to it. I think we recognize this and want to extend about it even more. This makes it includes for the vulnerable actors as well, right? Like for local small businesses or fishermen, for example. This is something they know their whole lives and may have a harder time changing trades unless the green left have actually a way to support them by giving food and basic necessities, right? which, considering how low of constituents and supporters that Green Left parties actually have, is inherently going to lose out on this, right? There is no way to help this kind of people in the working class to change the way they have livelihood and yet still make ends meet to make food, for example, or still have access to healthcare, right? It's just going to be much harder, and people will not be able to support it. And financially, it's not going to. And financially, I don't think it's going to happen to make livelihoods and ends meet for them, especially, right? Because they have gotten used to the capitalist lifestyle. Because Green Left, but secondly, we also recognize that because Green Left and Center Left parties are in mostly like European or white countries, right? I think it's easier for them to transition into a more green lifestyle, right? They have a kind of lifestyle where they can actually like afford green living, like for example, buying glass bottles or keep their sustainable living. And when you input system like garbage system for different types of recycled materials, for example, it's going to be easier because it's for different types. Education into living greener will be more feasible when the government inputs it into their policies, right? Which we think will more likely happen in this case. And it's going to be more introduced to the majority of the public. And this is much better. Why? Because people, even though it's not perfect, I think 100 people living green imperfectly will still be better than only the minority of indigenous people, like only 1% of the population or something, doing the conserving nature thing is just gonna be a small minority of what they can contribute to the environment, right? But when you include the majority into it, I think more impact will be happening for the environment in the first place. Okay, going to my second argument, which is what the center left parties will actually do with these companies, right? We think first they will have a mutual benefits with the companies. Because like we think that profit-driven innovation is always going to be on top when it comes to building the world together. Like, right, we take example for Tesla, like reducing the gas out of electricity, and people start to see it as something attractive because it is part of the future, right? I think exactly because of this capitalistic mindset that we already have, where people are more materialistic, for example, they were more. It will be more likely to sell this kind of innovative products to them rather than like forcing them to use to ride bikes, for example, instead of gas fuel cars. But even if they can, working class cannot afford to use these things, then we will still have options like going through public transportation, for example, right? But then just the transition of using more of these innovative products by these companies, because you are basically forcing them to cut costs in order to avoid this penalization of taxes, I think will bring more innovative process, right? Second, why it's likely to happen for these companies to work together, right? First of all, because they will want to think about lower costs, which will be taken into consideration if companies want to stay competitive. So even companies like H&M or fast fashion, for example, will still want to keep in mind that they have to keep reducing costs if they want to do something about keeping the companies competitive, right? First of all, because producing a lot of packaging is wasteful. So Coca-Cola, for example, they could go back to their system of reusing glass bottles rather than keeping on making plastic bottles, right? First of all, which is more sustainable for them, because lower costs in the first place is gonna contribute, is actually by working together with nature, right? Because when you actually produce less things, you get a lower cost, right? And second, policies which are company focused will punish them for being wasteful or harmful for the environment, right? So what the center left going to do is just basically make policies that penalize environmental damage and reward those that have contributed to less environmental damage, right? I think these things is more easier to be supported by the general public, because most people already have the education to want to live a sustainable living. And second of all, because they have the greater need of wanting to keep their jobs and keeping their more hedonistic livelihood, or keeping their capitalistic livelihood, right? Because this is the only trade they know, right? So why our framing matters? It's because we cater to the majority of the people, which actually can cater to the environmental damage as well, right? And then second, we show that by including the majority of the people, it's living sustainably will be implemented not only much faster, but also much more effectively. Very proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you. Last speaker from the Gulf side, Government Whip here.
Okay. For perfect gender pronoun, he, him, and if you want to POI, just unmute yourself because I won't be looking at the chat, but if you PY, just like don't spam, please, because it will disturb me. Okay. You can unmute yourself, but don't spam. Is it still kresek kresek? Test.
No, it was my internet, I think.
Oh, okay, sorry. Okay. Okay. Speech starting in 3, 2, 1. 3 things in the speech. 1, directly engaging towards opening opposition. 2nd, why our extension win this debate. Lastly, more direct invitation towards opening opposition, closing opposition. So first, let's deal with O first, right? The first thing that O says in this debate is that this debate is about probability and feasibility. Sadly, this is something that is wrong because this debate has never been about feasibility. And I want to be clear here. What OG says is that central left party, what O says is that central left party right now is winning. The question is, if central left party right now is winning, why the heck do we need to prioritize support central left party in the first place? What does this mean? It means that this debate needs to operate under the most swingy election, whether our support and our prioritization can swing the election or not. This already takes down O's framing, and this debate has never been about feasibility of election. And then what did O say? What the first thing that O says is that the center left is realistic and doesn't harm people, such as creating unemployment, so it is much more inclusive and people can relate to it. First of all, this is something that is wrong, because notice that Green Left Party is not as stupid as to privatize the whole business capital without creating a plan of unemployment, for example, right? And I want to be clear here. Right now, Green Left Party actually have a policy like the Green New Deal, for example, that uses the narrative such as saving jobs and creating employment. So their benefit about relatability, so that people will not be harmed, can still be countered under our side of the house, because we still use the narrative of privatizing and creating a more environmentally business model, but we still have relatability because jobs will be safe under our side of the house, and we use that narrative. But second of all, we push relatability that OG wants even better. The reason for that is because people want better job securities, and they have it under our side of the house. The reason for that is exactly what my member said, but when he linked to it about feminism and pacifism, which is much more relatable than what OG says. But third of all, notice that the comparative under their side of the house is that what you need to notice is that the stigma for a central left party is that they're very pandering towards corporation and the rich elite, which is the only 1% of the world. With that, the rest of the 99% of the population, which is the middle to lower class, is not able to relate towards the central left party, exactly because the narrative of that they are very pandering towards rich people, for example. So you cannot have the relatability under our side of the house, under their side of the house. And even if it exists, we still have that narrative to counter it. Another thing that O says is that corporations will opt in under their side of the house. Okay, let's flip this argument right now. There are a few things to say here. First, corporations are the one who are harming the environment and contribute to the more carbon emission. And this is something that is very important, is that corporations are not going to follow your policy, exactly because of their own characterization upon how much capitalistic the world is. Because if they say that the world is very capitalistic and you cannot change it, and even if central left party wins under their side of the house, their whole feasibility argument of creating policy and corporations pandering towards your policy will not work, simply because you cannot create changes in a capitalist structure with party that is not leftist enough. But second of all, you push this to the extreme by saying that you want to comply with large corporation. The reason why you pushed it to the extreme is because you have an actual discussion with corporation. Look, we are not saying that it's going to be asymmetrical and as crazy as OG says, but what we are saying is that there's an actual inherent incentive coming from the central left party to actually pander to these corporations to begin with. Under our side of the house, the comparative would be, even if corporations will demonize us, and even if the world is heavily capitalistic, this is still something that is okay, because we are literally not giving them any breaks, and we are depending on long-term and incremental change under our side of the house. And we are not saying that privatization is feasible right now, but in the next few elections, that is still feasible. Lastly, in terms of allies and corporate funding. First, what they say about allies and corporate funding, right? The first thing to say to this is that right now, environmentalists are already rich. Many people actually donate to leftist party for environmental foundation. Second, they need to give the reason why rich people want to support your environmental policy and your side of the house, where they literally cannot operate their businesses. It's either you have some radical policy and shut down all of those corporations, or you have some moderate policy such as greenwashing, just like my member said before. But third of all, notice that allies are much better under our side of the house, right? I'll take you after this. Exactly, because all of them are radical. The reason why being radical is good is because they are obsessed with you. If they're obsessed with you, they're less likely to leave you, and they're more likely to give more and more support because they're obsessed with the environmental issue. So we have better corporate funding under our side of the house, because rich people who are radical in terms of environmental justice is more likely to support us even more. Al's case is that. Let's check POI. Go.
The opening that CG has as a knife OG is that, okay, we have limited political resource. Therefore, visibility becomes important because that limited resource needs to be allocated efficiently through policy changes. Why that doesn't happen on your side?
Yeah, exactly. That's the framing from closing government, right? Like, we are saying that feasibility is not the debate, even if it's a knife towards OG, I don't care. So why does our extension wins this debate? Let's compare this towards OG. OG's argument is saying that Green Left Party protects indigenous. How do you weigh this closing government? The way that you weigh us towards OG is in terms of inclusivity. Even if they want to say they want to protect indigenous people, the question is, why does Central Left Party doesn't have that inherent incentive to protect indigenous people? Compare our best scenario towards opening opposition about greenwashing is that even if you make policy under their side of the house that is seen as supporting to an environment, that is still not going to happen because of greenwashing, right? People will still see this as something that is okay, but the reality is not even the same. So even if the changes that OO makes is that you can still like create some good policy making, but greenwashing will still exist because of heavy backdooring and etc. The effectivity of OG's argument also needs to be considered, right? Because the effectivity of protecting the environment from OG is that it is going to be based on a traditional method. This is not going to go out with this debate because the problem right now is a large scale exploitation by corporations and not a small scale exploitation, just like the Bangkili, for example, just like the OG says, for example, right? So the scale of benefit is much larger under our side of the house. Let's deal with CEO, right? The response that CEO gave to you upon our argument is that fishermen will be harmed under our side of the house. Few things to say to this. First, we'll still have universal basic income. We to give them money to survive while still we're in the process of privatization. Like, they're still able to sustain themselves under our side of the house. But second of all, fishermen is going to be much worse under your side of the house, and you push this to the extreme because corporations right now throwing wastes to the sea, and people are literally using plastic and etc. Because you cannot stop them to do so under your side of the house, because you cannot make a radical policy. You only make like a moderate policy that is not really that significant. So you also hurt the quality of fishermen's fish under your side of the house. The comparative under our side of the house, if you regulate these things and the whole structure is an incremental change that is very much likely, and this deals with whole opposition bench argument proposed.
Thank you. Welcoming the last speaker of the round. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah.
Let me start up my paper. Let me start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Before I move on to my questions, I would like to engage with the different benches here in this debate. Firstly, in terms of OG, right? OG proposal about how they'll support the disenfranchisement. We say that it's as simple as it is not feasible, not realistic, and it will not be supported by whoever in the first place. So exactly because they have not explained to you, educator, as to how the disenfranchisement will be popular amidst the people voting, and therefore like the policies won't fly at all, right? Furthermore, the prioritization of these Aboriginal minorities will never help the environment significantly if you don't try to push for the majority to live cleanly as well. This is due to the fact that, like, as you can see in the status quo, the Aboriginals here, for example, they are already struggling to by themselves, let alone try to encourage people, right? Therefore, we believe that this green left won't get as much support, right? And OG's case should just fly out. And secondly, in terms of OO, they did not show any systematic analysis on how companies are going to work and live sustainably, and they don't show about the roles of the working class. They simply said about how it is feasible for them, about how it is feasible because it's going to trend in the popular, but they never really explain about how it will cater to the working class, right? Meanwhile, we as the CEO, we already stated to you, educator, about how it will cater to the working class. Here's how, right? Basically, when you vote for center left policies that are more moderate and that will work more in line with the policies that are created by the policies that are more in line with the companies, with the capitalistic and with the majority. Firstly, the majority will be more likely to opt into the trend, right? Exactly because the status quo is progressive enough, right? Where the majority is already somewhat educated, right? The moment they opt into something as simple, right, and along with socialization, they'll then start to slowly realize that like the environment is actually important, right? So we believe that starting first, like from the greenwashing, it's all right due to the fact that it's the first step, right? When we slowly introduce them and then create changes for them majorly, I think we believe that there will be a more sustainable change due to the fact that there's education, due to the fact that there's change that's there, right? Therefore, we have to make it first interesting for the general public to follow, which is more sustainable in CO and it's not explained in OO whatsoever, right? And moreover, CG also mentioned about how this fisherman is worse, like about how corporations keep dumping fish into the sea, and about how it is unable to change the policies radically. Well, here's the thing, right? In terms of companies, we believe that the companies are not as powerful as what all the other benches try to claim, right? We believe that there's still some mechanisms and policies created against companies in terms of their conduct and actions, right? There are plenty of those already. Moreover, we believe that there's also a major check and balance from the people themselves, right? Obviously, so we believe that it is feasible the moment when you when the people are first educated or policies and etc. By the center left, when the people are more aware of this, they'll be able to see which companies are doing things that are wrong, inherently wrong, which are companies are greenwashing. Like it will be a gradual step, but they'll get there. Right? And then the moment when they see these companies, they'll be able to then do this simple thing of boycotting the company's products. Right? The moment when a company is inherently seen as bad on the media, when people trend that something is bad, which is feasible to happen because for a lot of people, because the voices of the media of the people are able to trend a lot lately in many platforms such as Instagram, TikToks, Facebook, and etc. They'll be able to boycott the companies of their bad actions. For example, when there are bad skincare products that harm the environment, for example, or they harm the people will then boycott the company and spread about it, right? We say that this discussion is feasible, right? Therefore, we believe that both OOCG also should fly out of this debate, right? Several clashes that I want to bring in this debate, right? In terms of, firstly, what is actually in terms of which side can actually cater to the happenings in the status quo, and secondly, which party is better at the end of the day, right? Firstly, in terms of what is actually happening in this, right? So so we cannot really take the opening bench discussion because they have because their cases are too extreme. So let's just take the CG's case, right? They say about how the happenings it wouldn't happen, about how like the policies wouldn't be happen without radical policy changes because like, and that basic income things, right? We say that firstly, no, we say that status quo is not as bad as what they describe, right? Since this type of parties usually happen in the Western Hemisphere, like for example the Europe and etc. We believe that these people who have stayed there will not be able to truly believe in the policies that are enacted by the green left parties, exactly because they have enjoyed the benefits of the capitalism and have lived through prosperously in their countries, right? We believe that first that that due to this characterization, we believe that we cannot we don't think that majority will able to opt in into the green left. So therefore, we don't see any feasibility of the policies flying, right? And even if the radical policies will fly, we believe that it will only harm the majority that have been living here. The majority, not only that, but also the majority, which are the fishermen, which are the working class, right? Obviously, so right. But the moment when you give two policies that are too radical towards companies, right? For example, we believe that you will not impact the direct people who are creating the bad strategies in the company in the first place, but the people underground. They'll instead of actually trying to change, right? The moment you make something too radical and not try to work with the companies, you'll instead make the companies fire their the lower minority and the lower working class that are working in their companies. They'll instead cut costs. They'll instead reduce wages. That's what will happen if you try to implement a radical policy that's too radical, right? Whereas if you try to implement something that's more moderate, when you try to work together with capitalism, like what we as CO have already proposed, we believe that it is more feasible for corporations to be inherent to work with us, right? Exactly because environmentalism is trending right now. Like Greta Thunberg is booming a lot right now, right? Therefore, we believe that like companies are more inherent to try to opt in, and that's why what's actually happening supports center left wing parties more than green left. Thank you.
Thank you, Apoi, for that speech. So basically, please wait for 5 or 10 minutes for the